All right, we're about to open a case file on one of the most significant and, let's be honest, most debated questions in all of history. But here's the twist. For this investigation, we're setting aside the text you might expect. Instead, we're going to build our case using only the words of outsiders, skeptics, and even enemies. So let's just get right to it. Before you can even begin to ask if the claims of Christianity are true, you have to answer a much more fundamental question. Was Jesus of Nazareth an actual historical figure, or is he basically a myth? I mean, the claims that grew up around this figure are absolutely enormous. They changed the world. But we are not here today to prove or disprove theology. Our job is much more foundational. We're here to clear the ground, to see if this entire story is anchored in a real time, a real place, and in public events that historians can actually get their hands on. So let's officially open the file. Now, before we look at a single piece of evidence, we have to establish the rules of the game. How do historians decide if anyone from the ancient world, Caesar, Socrates, anyone, was a real person? What's in their toolkit? Well, it really boils down to a few key principles. Historians are always looking for multiple, independent sources. And you know what they love? Sources from people who are not fans of the person or movement. They also look for early accounts. The closer to the event, the better. The story needs to fit with what we already know about that period of history. And this is a big one. It needs to have the power to actually explain why a massive movement started. This is the toolkit we'll be using. So with our toolkit ready, let's turn to the evidence. And we're going to start with what historians call external anchors. These are sources from completely outside the Christian faith. They are absolutely crucial because they come from a neutral, or in some cases, a downright hostile point of view. Our first witness is the great Roman historian Tacitus. Now, let's be clear. Tacitus had zero love for Christians. He called their faith a mischievous superstition. But in the middle of describing them, he casually drops this historical bombshell. He links their founder, Christus, to a very specific public event, an execution under a very specific Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. Next up, we have the Jewish historian Josephus. He's not writing about Jesus here. He's actually recording the death of a man named James. But to make sure his readers know which James he's talking about, he identifies him as the brother of Jesus who was called Christ. He just assumes everyone reading knows who he means. You know, for a historian, that kind of offhand incidental reference, that is pure gold. And for our third external witness, we have a letter from Pliny the Younger. He's a Roman governor, and he's writing a memo to the emperor trying to figure out, what do I do with these Christians? And in his official report, he describes their main activity. They get together and sing hymns to Christ as to a god. This shows us that from very early on, this was a public movement that was known for one very specific thing. Its worship of Christ. Okay, let's put this all on one grid. Look at this. From 3 different non-Christian sources, all writing within about 80 years of the events, which is pretty quick for ancient history, we get independent agreement on the core facts. A man named Christ, who was executed by Pontius Pilate, had a well-known brother named James, and was worshipped as a god by a growing number of followers. All right, so based only on these external anchors, these non-Christian sources, what can a responsible historian actually conclude? What's the initial verdict from our case file? Based on this evidence alone, we can establish a pretty clear historical baseline. A real person named Jesus existed. He was executed by the Roman authorities under Pontius Pilate. His followers went on to form a recognizable movement that spread, and this movement was defined by its unique devotion to him. This baseline, just on its own, presents a major challenge to the idea that Jesus was a complete myth invented centuries later. Of course, no historical case is airtight, and every piece of evidence has to face scrutiny. So let's put our findings on the stand. It's time for a cross-examination, where we tackle the biggest and most common objections. Okay, 2 questions almost always come up right away. First, hey, wait a minute, aren't these sources written decades after Jesus died? And second, couldn't these historians just be repeating rumors they heard from Christians? Both are fair questions. So let's take the first one. For the ancient world, having sources written within a century is actually considered very early and very good evidence. But more importantly, the hostile context is actually a strength. Think about it. Tacitus and Pliny were not trying to do Christianity any favors. They were reporting on a punishment and a superstition. The fact that they still confirm the basic historical framework makes their testimony more powerful, not less. All right, on to two more heavy hitters. Skeptics often point to a famous debate about whether Christian scribes tampered with one of Josephus's writings. And then there's the big one. If he was real, where are the artifacts? Where is the archaeological proof? Let's tackle these one by one. First, that debate over Josephus. It focuses on a completely different, much more flowery passage. The simple passing reference to James that we used is considered historically solid by the vast majority of scholars. As for archaeology, well, that's what we call an argument from silence. The truth is we don't have archaeological proof for almost anybody from that time and place. A lack of artifacts for a peasant teacher from Galilee is exactly what we'd expect. So, when you put it all together, the external case file makes a pretty strong argument that Jesus was a real person. But once you establish that, it doesn't end the conversation. It actually kicks off a much, much bigger one. See, once existence is on the table, the investigation naturally has to look at the earliest Christian sources themselves, not just as theology, but as historical documents. And what's amazing is how incredibly early some of them are, with letters from the Apostle Paul, for example, showing up just a couple of decades after the events they're talking about. And when you look at these super early writings, you find something really specific. This passage right here, scholars believe this is a kind of creed, one of the first ever summaries of the Christian message. Something Paul was quoting that was even older than his letter. And notice what it says. The core message wasn't just about a wise teacher. It was centered on three specific public claims: a death, a burial, and a proclaimed resurrection. And that's where this leaves us. The external, non-Christian evidence makes it very, very difficult to argue that Jesus of Nazareth was simply a myth. But establishing his existence doesn't close the case file. In a way, it just opens the really important one. The bigger and far more profound question isn't if he was, but who he was.